Everyone. This is Shannan Vance-Ocampo. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the General Presbyter of the Presbytery of Southern New England. And this is connecting our conversations, our podcast space for conversations that push the edges of our faith and help us to deepen discipleship. The Presbytery of Southern New England is a regional governing body in the Presbyterian Church, USA. Today, we are having a special podcast. We're going to welcome one of our own from the staff of our presbytery, our Communications Manager Katie Grosh, and her partner Ben Bond, who is a disability justice advocate and works with the organization RespectAbility. We're going to take some time today to talk about the important issues around disability inclusion and ministry, and how to make your ministry a more welcoming space. So a big welcome, Katie and Ben, to connecting our conversations. It's so great to have both of you here with us.
Yeah, great to be here.
Yeah. So I always like to start out with just introductions and giving you each some space to share who you are, tell us a little bit about you. Katie, I know many in the presbytery who might be listening to this know you, but we have many listeners to the podcast beyond the presbytery. So tell us a bit about yourselves, who you are, what you do, what you're up to these days, all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely, yeah. So as Shannan said, my name is Katie Grosh, she, her pronouns. I work for the Presbytery of Southern New England as the Communications Manager, and I grew up in the United Methodist Church and have really found a wonderful community within the PCUSA. I also work for First Presbyterian Church of New Haven, doing their communications. And this year I'm also doing CPE, Clinical Pastoral Education. So a whole variety of things that I do, and have really enjoyed working with the Presbyterian Church and try to make the communications work that I do as accessible as possible. I got a Master's of Divinity degree from Yale Divinity School in 2022, and that's how I met my partner, Ben.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I should also mention that Katie is serving as camp chaplain for Presbyterian Church up in New Hampshire this summer. So her work is deeply rooted in the Presbyterian community.
We might be accused of trying to steal Katie from the Methodists these days, right? We're not beneath such things in the Presbytery of Southern New England, I just want to say.
You're doing a very good job of being welcoming, so I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, my name is Ben Bond. I use he and they pronouns. I am ordained in the Disciples of Christ Church, which is also a mainline Protestant progressive tradition, much smaller than the PCUSA, and kind of similar to the United Church of Christ in like theology and polity. I'll also give a visual description just to start off a little bit of accessibility, giving examples of how that can be really useful. A lot of times in disability spaces, we'll give what's called a visual description. And honestly, in podcast form, not a terrible practice for a listening platform. For folks who may not be blind or low vision, but may just be listening while they're driving in the car. So, a visual description usually consists of just describing specific identities about yourself, particular things that might be of importance for someone who is blind or low vision to particular visual information that a lot of folks who have vision would have access to in a conversation, so that folks can actually track in the conversation who's speaking, and particular important identities that they may have that contribute to their perspective in that conversation. So a visual description for me is I am a white person who is genderqueer, who is very masculine presenting, I have brown hair, a long brown and reddish beard, glasses, and a red shirt. And behind me, I have a white RespectAbility, which is the organization I work for, virtual background. And that's a visual description. It can be short and sweet like that. And it can be really helpful for, like I said, accessibility for folks who are blind and low vision, but also those who may be listening in their car. Important stuff about me. I'm also Katie Grosh's partner. And we met, as she said, at Yale Divinity School, where we both received our Masters of Divinity. I also did a certificate in the Institute of Sacred Music and Arts program at Yale. Um, and a lot of my focus at Yale Divinity School was on disability in the church. I helped actually, I was a co-founder of the first disability student organization, Divine Abilities at Yale Divinity School, which was the first in 150 years of history to be a disability org. And that's been a real joy for me to have that opportunity to talk to students and faculty at the time about disability issues and how the church has played a role. Kind of both culturally and interpersonally, and shaping our perspectives of disability, and working towards kind of a reconciliation model towards some of the harm the church has and continues to perpetuate towards disabled folks. And yeah, I also serve on the New Haven Disability Commission, and I'm the co-chair of the Interfaith Disability Advocacy Coalition in Washington, D.C., where we do a lot of policy advocacy on Capitol Hill around disability from a faith-informed perspective. Um, and most my day job is I'm the Faith Inclusion and Belonging Associate at RespectAbility, which is a national disability nonprofit that focuses on advancing opportunities and erasing stigmas for disabled folks across the country. It's a diverse, cross-disability led disability organization, and we are the only national organization with a dedicated faith inclusion department focused on accessibility for faith communities of all traditions. Um, and yeah, that's a long introduction, but I'm grateful to be here with you. And thanks for having us, Shannon.
Yeah, that's so helpful, Ben. And I really appreciated the visual introduction you just offered as a way to help us be aware of the kind of space we're in and what people do and don't see. I'm not visually impaired in any way. Like, I have full sight as a person, even though I am beginning to need like progressives, so they tell me, but I don't wear them all the time because I don't always listen to what my doctor tells me to do. And then later in the day, my eyes start hurting, and I'm like, oh, I should have done it. But I really like the way you put that together and explained it and then modeled it, because I was also thinking as you spoke that it's a really good way to just it also like helps to slow down, because I think um oftentimes we sort of speed through things and forget what else is going on in the space around us, or what other needs people may have, or even attuned to them. And it is really helpful. And even just to mention that many of us listen to podcasts when we're driving or walking, and we're not looking at it. And so our visual cues are off, and we may be making even assumptions about the people we're listening to. Um, I also find that some of those practices that help us slow down are also practices that can be deeply spiritual and help us slow down and notice the divine within us. And the more we understand each other, the more we see that. At least for me, I feel like the more I slow down and see people and see them better, and as in their fullness and wholeness, you begin to see their divinity more and where God is showing up. So I really appreciated that visual introduction. It helped me slow down and think differently about the space. So thank you, Ben. That was really, really
Yeah,
helpful just
I'll
to kind
also
of,
say, from like an individual perspective, as someone who does this a lot now in different spaces, I find it really compelling how when you start doing that practice, is it helps remind you of your own social location in a space, almost reinforces like, oh yeah, I have these particular identities that may not be super common, but I also may have these identities that are often the identities with privilege. And so I think it's a really interesting practice for folks to like think deeply and think intentionally about what it means to show up in a particular space, and what we bring to that space, and what we don't bring. But yeah, I think I agree that slowing down and really leaning into intentionally getting to know one another is a huge part of our spirituality. And I can talk about it later, but there's a really incredible um, concept called crip time, or disability time, where it's really about how disability often requires a slowness, or requires a modification of time that non-disabled, or as I like to call folks, pre-disabled, um,
Mm.
don't necessarily ascribe to. And a lot of things can get lost when we are rushing through and not giving ourselves space to really um, slow and be present, and attend to each other's needs and our own needs. I should also mention I have multiple disabilities. I feel like that's probably important to this conversation. I have um, some significant physical disabilities, uh, chronic illness, as well as some really significant chronic pain related to an injury. And I
Mm.
also have dyslexia, which has been a lifelong disability experience that most of my family has as well. So um, I'm speaking from a lot of different contexts, but uh,
Yeah.
it's very helpful for folks to know that about me. And I think 80% of our organization also identifies as disabled, which is really great for us to be kind of practicing what we teach. So yeah, but happy to give you the space to ask us some questions, Shannon.
Yeah. And I appreciate that too, Ben, because so many of us live with disabilities or have family members who live with disabilities. And sometimes they are things that have been lifelong and everyone knows about and are really clear. And oftentimes they're very hidden or they come upon us suddenly. I know my own husband suffered a brain injury in 2007 as a
Mm,
result of a car accident.
mm,
And I had to do a lot of learning alongside him, and the um, the uh, the neuropsychologist who really kind of put his brain back together in a lot of ways afterwards and helped him learn how to function with the way his brain was now. After the accident, said, "This is not therapy you do individually. There's a lot of stuff I'll do with you because you are the patient,
mm.
but your wife needs to be here for all the sessions too, because you have to learn together how to manage this and also how to live with it and grow with it." And it was really a beautiful way that he offered that to us. Um, and I really appreciated that when, you know, he sat us down and gave us that diagnosis and also told us what we could expect going forward, and also shared his faith with us, mostly because he knew I was a clergy person. And so we had this really beautiful conversation. So I think it can show up in all sorts of different ways, and some things are really visible. My husband's, you know, kind of chronic thing, nobody really notices anymore. But it's always there, right? So, and I think that that's present for people in all sorts of different ways. So we just know these
Yeah,
things, we name them as we kind of come into the space. So I think it's helpful.
I
So
can
I'm
also.
curious too, as I say that, if you and Katie can kind of like jump off of that about, you know, you started it a little bit, Ben, like what got you engaged in this space, a little bit of your own personal story. But for both of you, like what made you sense a call to this particular area of ministry, or what other pieces of interest pulled you in this direction, and um, kind of that Holy Spirit pulling you in this way?
Yeah, I also really appreciate you sharing your story about your husband. I find sometimes it can be helpful to ground folks in just some basic like disability 101 statistics and things. So like just like you said, a lot of folks encounter disability who you would never be aware are experiencing disability. The statistic currently for disabled folks in the United States is around 70% of disabled people have what we affectionately call in the disability community non-apparent disabilities. Which is different from apparent disabilities, which most folks, which often are conjured, what we conjure and comes to mind when we think of disability, like folks in wheelchairs, folks who are blind and using a seeing eye cane, folks who have like very like stereotypical, um, uh, easily place disabilities in our minds due to culture and media representation. But a majority of disabled folks have disabilities that are not apparent to the average person in our society. And on top of that, it is 25% of people in the United States have a disability. We are the largest protected minority group in the United States. So the kind of common rule of thumb is like 1 in 4 folks in the United States have a disability or would qualify as having a disability under the Americans with Disability Act, which was signed in 1990. And the Americans with Disability Act um, covers all private and public entities within the United States to ensure they're accessible, except notably faith communities lobbied, particularly Christian faith communities, lobbied very, very hard in the 1990s to ensure that we would be exempt from having to comply with the Americans with Disability Act, which actually somewhat sparked my
Yeah,
my
and that's a
calling.
really disappointing piece of information to hear, right? Like,
Yeah.
are folks listening, like, let's just pause for a minute and consider the idea that when the Americans with Disabilities Act went into law in the United States and was getting, all the run up that happens in Congress to make something law, faith-based, mostly Christian organizations lobbied against having to be held to those standards. What does that say about our community related to this? Obviously I would say that's a negative for our community.
Yeah.
It's also sort of theologically offensive, I would say, because um, I would say, and maybe not everybody thinks this way, but I think we actually worship a disabled God, right? So what does that say when we think about that? So we can get into that conversation in a bit, but I do think this is something to consider, and it raises the question of how do we do things in a reparative way. So I just want to like flag that, tag it. Maybe most people didn't know that Christian communities did this, and it's just something else we need to kind of put into our consciousness and consider. I'll let you continue, Ben, but I want to
Yeah.
like just pause there. It's a big one.
No, absolutely. Thank you so much for flagging that. And yeah, it's we don't know what we don't know. So it's really good to be able to share that information and help folks to think and reflect on what that means for us as a community. And what we may owe to the disabled community as reconciliation and efforts as Christians committed to social justice. So yeah, I that was I kind of that really sparked a fire under me. I realized that when I attended Yale Divinity School, their accessibility services were a bit lacking. And that's not to be an indictment of them, though if they receive it as such, they're always able to improve if they feel called to do that. That was part of our hope and part of our work. I think the other thing to mention is that, like, I find that often, ableism, which is a term that many folks can probably assume similar to any other prejudice, similar with an ism, is prejudice towards disabled folks, both institutionally and interpersonally. But ableism, I began to learn, was much less often targeted or malicious or intentional on the part of individuals. Sometimes institutionally, it's a little more pernicious, but um, I noticed that it was often just a matter of neglect, and well-meaning people um, either not having the resources or not seeking out the resources to be proactive and looking out to ensure that disabled folks are included. And I found that was the case at Yale Divinity School as well, for me particularly, and I know other folks in the community as well. And some folks experienced excellent, resource stuff is felt very, very well considered and accommodated. But I had gotten together with other disabled students at Yale, and we realized we needed a community. Um, and I was a lifelong dyslexic person, and didn't receive accommodations until I got to graduate school at Yale, which is kind of shocking and in a sense um, something that didn't should probably in retrospect, it would have been if I had not been in a working class family, it may have gone differently. However, when getting to Yale, I realized that we started this community, and there's several different models of disability. There's um, and I'll explain why this is relevant to why this got me invested in this work. There's the medical model, which explains or sees disability as something that needs to be cured or fixed through science, or medicine, and that disability is a net negative, and that every disabled person should desire to fix said disability. And there's also the social model, which pushes back a bit on that, which sees that disability is the challenges of disability are institutional and systematic, and that the consequences of like the harm that disabled people face are from society and from ableism and prejudice, much less the disability itself. And one of the original models that I think sometimes gets left out in disability activism is the moral or faith model of disability, which sees often, particularly in the Christian historical context, disability as related to sin, and sinfulness, and there is a tremendous amount of information and depictions of that kind of thinking within our religious texts, and within our theological within our theological canon over the centuries, and I started to realize, huh, a lot of the ableism and perspectives of morality related to disability in our current day um, directly are inspired and informed by Christian thought on disability. And I think it's really important. And so I was like, I really want to do something about that. I want to have those conversations and think about those things. Um, and so I dedicated a lot of my effort at Yale Divinity School to kind of do a self-taught curriculum. Um, but I'm speaking a bit. Katie joined
Yeah.
this work, doing it through Divine Abilities as our communications director there. And if you wanted to chat about that for a minute too, I'm sure your family history also is significant. So
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, definitely. So as communications manager for Presbyterian of Southern New England, I got my first ever communications experience through Divine Abilities, serving as their communications manager for sending out emails and making graphics for Instagram and doing that kind of organizational behind the scenes work to support the other people involved in this student group, to support the leaders. So that was really my introduction in learning accessibility practices for communications work. Things like image descriptions on, photos or captions on videos, and that work galvanized me and was important in learning things that I've carried forward. I do not identify as disabled. Things like my vision, I desperately need glasses, but I'm able to have accommodations like prescription lenses that allow me to move through the world in ways that I do not experience it as a disabling circumstance. There is a history of chronic illness within my family. So seeing my mom and my sister have experiences with chronic illness has allowed me to know throughout my life that disability is something that could be present within my life, knowing my own genetics and my family history. The experience of loving disabled people and being a care companion to Ben, meeting some of their access needs in various capacities, has called me to be an ally in this space and to use the tools and the gifts that I have to promote the work of disability justice, and also to continue learning. It was really wonderful with Ben's work and the other work of students at Divine Abilities. Yale Divinity School offered a class in disability theology, so I was really glad to take that course at YDS. Again, taught because of the activism and encouragement from the folks at Divine Abilities, to attend things like the Institute on Theology and Disability, ITD, which this year is being held in Boston, and I'm so excited to be back in that space, to continue learning and listening and appreciating all the things that disabled folks are sharing.
Great. I definitely want to talk about some resources, and I want to kind of put some of that conversation about your organization that you work with, Ben, with that. But first I want to talk about just some of the questions in local congregations. So I've served as a local church pastor, and we did things in both of my two local ministries where we would create spaces that were more inclusive and able for people to get into. Most of that was probably the pretty standard stuff, like making sure we had a lift to get from one part of the building to another. The first church I served had kind of like a narthex area you came into, and then like some steps that went down and some steps that went up. It was sort of like not like a full flight, but a half a flight. And so making creating a lift for folks that had trouble with the stairs. That church did have a handicap ramp for wheelchairs to get in, and had a system for those who needed help with hearing, was something as well. And also did like at that time sent like tapes home to those who were homebound, right, of the worship services. So some of that kind of more standard stuff, but didn't do things like a bulletin in different kinds of print, or at that time we were not making accommodations. This was like in the early 2000s, or thinking about children with things such as, like, say, autism. And I look back at that ministry now and I realize I had a child who was probably presenting as somewhere in that autism spectrum or something like that. I don't know what his particular diagnosis was, but I look back at it now. And I also, the parents were very like filled with shame about it and were trying to like hide it and trying to kind of co-opt us into some of that. So I look back at that thing in ministry. There wasn't quite like, I didn't have enough training or language at that time. And, it's sort of interesting. So those, I definitely look at that. I also have had experiences where, I had colleagues in my last mid-council position, some pastors who got together and created a new worshiping community specifically for families with children who were autistic because oftentimes they struggle with kids if there's not specific accommodations made for them, or congregations oftentimes are not welcoming to those kids or treat them badly or kind of give parents the side eye if they're being, quote unquote, disruptive in the space and not understanding. And so that was helpful for them. So I'm curious if you can just talk about that kind of bucket of stuff, Ben or Katie, about like how can congregations be thinking about ways to be welcoming in their space? What are some of the basics, and what are some of the things that can really take them to the next level? And how can they be doing those things more intuitively?
Absolutely. That is a really good question. And I am thrilled to give you uh, a whole list of things. And I think what's really important, because I'm going to give a checklist, but I think that it's always important to see a checklist, like understand the stakes of that checklist and why it's really important and vital for congregations and for individuals. And I always try to reiterate to folks that, like, because disability is the largest protected minority group in the United States, and the reality that all ability is temporary. I'll say that one again because it's a good thing to hold on to, is like all ability is temporary. Someone, yourself included, will be disabled in your lifetime. And that's something that I think is a big thing for folks to grapple with, because in our society there's a really intense desire to avoid becoming disabled at all costs. And because it is so deeply stigmatized, and whether people acknowledge it or not, are aware of the consequences of living a disabled life. And it is one of the only minority groups you can become a part of at any time. Um, and so from a very selfish perspective, and from a community perspective, it is essential that you have these things in place, because it's not a matter of us helping them, it's us helping us, because we will be in these positions. And the quicker that we can acknowledge that, and start to work on it, the quicker we can start to destigmatize, and the better supported we will be as a community. It will help. The other reality is faith communities demographically trend on the older side, and it is a safety concern to ensure that our congregants have
Yep.
accessibility. It's also a sustainability concern. It's a retention concern for folks who are in clergy positions, for ensuring that the congregation that you have is going to be the congregation that can sustainably continue coming. So those are the stakes of this checklist. It's really important. So I think kind of the helpful framing as well. I think a lot of times clergy and laity come up against this barrier of, well, the first barrier is cost. How are we going to afford this? This is completely unsustainable. Like, we have to keep the heat on, which is fair. Accessibility can require some more um, significant investment. I think, so interestingly enough, the accessibility measures that folks take first are often the most expensive because they're the most commonly known. Um, and so it's a really interesting thing. I think I try to help folks recognize that, like, putting in an elevator and a ramp are probably going to be the most expensive accessibility measures you take. They're also the only ones that people think of when it comes to accessibility. And so I try to encourage people to reframe that perspective and consider the fact that there are so many ways, and fairly inexpensive ways, to start implementing accessibility as soon as possible. And that sort of spirit of accessibility can hopefully ramp folks up and start to see, oh, this is really beneficial, not just for disabled folks, but for me. And also, um, if you're not disabled now, it may be really helpful when you become disabled. But nevertheless, I think the thing that a lot of us disability advocates try to reinforce is that accommodations, and universal design and access, is helpful for all folks. The same way that, like, for example, with a ramp, it's helpful for folks who have wheelchairs, but also for mothers who want to bring their children in their I don't know why the word pram is coming to mind, but it's a stroller. I've listened
Stroller, yeah.
to too many English people speak. But yeah, bringing their stroller into the congregation. And if you want young families to be at your church, you gotta have, moms with strollers. So, it's a real clear example of how accessibility measures benefit everybody. So some of those things include, and I can include resources for Shannon and Katie to share, that
Yeah, we
are
want to, if you have a checklist like that or
do.
a resource, we would love to put that in our show notes and on the
That.
website when we share this, because I guarantee you Presbyterians are very diligent. They'll be emailing us like, Ben said he has a checklist. Where is
Ah!
it? So
I
we
love
want to
that.
put it out there. Presbyterians, like, they do their homework and they like show up for that stuff. So yeah,
Absolutely.
give it to us. We'll definitely take it then.
As a fellow nerd, I'm all about it. Yeah, so some of the basic things that can be implemented fairly quickly, as Shannon already mentioned, accessible print bulletins can be something that you implement. Captioning is something that's actually quite doable these days. If you already have a projector up for like presenting lyrics for, hymns, or presenting the hymns of the day. Even Zoom itself has an automatic captioning service that's free, that you can immediately, if you have a microphone set up, the Zoom will start captioning whatever folks in the congregation are saying, ensuring that you have good audio-visual things. I think accessibility is important to consider both, in a twofold approach, both like practical logistical measures, but also attitudes and training. So it's really important to have audiovisual technology that's effective, but if you have it and nobody uses it, you might as well not have it. So it's really important to train congregants and lay leaders, and pastors to use audiovisual technology, because folks are going to have trouble seeing and hearing. And even if you think you have a loud voice, I promise you there are people who still can't hear you. And so there's that spirit of accessibility and thinking through, like, it's not just about me. We have to consider, the whole body of Christ, so to speak. And um, you know, just because the ears, I don't want to get too into metaphors with sensory stuff because that can get really messy. But as Corinthians talks about, like, one part is not more important than the other, and each part needs to consider what one part can and can't do, and each part is like vital to the whole. So yeah, so there's captioning, there is audiovisual things. There's also one of the things that folks can do, again, very simple, fairly financially doable thing. It's really nice to have sections of, let's say, often New England, there's going to be pews, to have pews that are either removed, maybe in the middle part in the sanctuary, so that wheelchair users, or folks who need movable chairs can be present, not just in the back of the congregation, so they're not like segregated or relegated to the back, either intentionally, often unintentionally. But that's one of the measures that can be taken. Having headphones up at the front for folks who have audio um, deficiencies, or for folks, the other thing, having on top of that, not just headphones audiovisual wise, but earbuds, and or like stim uh uh spinners for folks who have sensory needs. Often like spaces can be really, like church spaces can be really overstimulating, so providing earbuds at the front of the congregation can be a really helpful way to acknowledge that, like, yeah, sometimes it can be overwhelming. Here are these tools that we have, again, very inexpensive. And then the other thing that I find to be a fairly accessible thing to do for, and again, I say accessibility interchangeably in terms of like actual disability related accessibility, but also just like accessibility for congregations to achieve. Designating a space within the church that can be a low sensory space for folks to rest and take a break from the service or from fellowship, and just to lay down or to, the same way that like having a room for mothers can be really helpful. A space like that can be really helpful for disabled folks and for any of us. But those are
Absolutely.
just a few suggestions. And again, I will share our checklist that Respectability has put together and worked diligently on. These are just some ideas. But yeah, and again, it's really important to have those physical things. And then I'll also say from a like theological, practical space as well, start interrogating how different theologies might present particularly prejudice, perspectives. Like, are there disabled people? Well, clearly there are disabled people in the Gospels. How are we talking about those disabled people? Are we solely a metaphor for Jesus's divinity? Or do we have an active role? Do we have theological claims that are important? Um, are you, as a clergy person or lay leader, ever preaching about disability? Is it a subject matter that comes up in your, preaching cycles? How do you navigate the healing stories?
Mhm.
And when it comes to like committees, is disability talked about in a diversity, equity, inclusion committee? Are disabled folks, which again, 1 in 4, they probably are at your congregation. Are they there? And if they are there, are they in places of leadership? Are they in places of community and fellowship? So it's that twofold approach. We can get people in the congregation, but once they get there, we got to make sure that what they're experiencing isn't also harmful.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
that kind of both and sort of thing. So
Yeah.
um,
It's really
yeah.
interrogating the text. I mean, the good thing about, our tradition and sort of the Reformed traditions, right, that we're all in, the three of us on this call, sort of in the Reformed big bucket, right? But that we do value that exegetical work of preaching. And so part of that is interrogating the text and really looking at it, why was Jesus healing people? What was Jesus trying to achieve through the healing of people? Is it just about the healing or is it about something else? And what was being said and how can we talk about it? And I think those are important things to not just be in the miracle space, right? Oh my gosh, it's amazing. Jesus healed the withered hand or did this, but like, what does it mean that Jesus, wanted people to, lower someone through a roof? What does, like really interrogating those pieces and getting, making the text more expansive and opening them up for people and even creating I could see a sermon series just on some of that. I also am thinking as I'm sort of remembering some things, Ben, as you're talking, is my first call, we were was doing a lot of educational ministry and sort of the straight line way of doing church school where like kids are in classrooms based on their grade in school and they just do Bible stories really wasn't working. And at that time the rotation curriculum was really big in Christian education circles, and the idea was kids worked on a Bible story for 4 to 5 weeks, but they rotated each week in their teams, their sort of little, their, sort of age pods through different ways of looking at it, like a computer classroom or an art classroom. And the classrooms were set up thematically and the kids rotated amongst them. But that also dealt with like different learning styles in the kids, and that they didn't all, like, not every kid gets it through traditional lessons, and some kids might be able to learn more when they, work on it through art or through a nature classroom or things like that. Um, the other interesting story to share is that I also, the last call I had before this one was also in presbytery work, and that presbytery, we formed a lot of what we call new worshiping communities. I shared this story on a previous podcast. We had a pastor who decided to do one that was all outside. She was very into she was like an outdoors person, did a lot of like skiing and whitewater rafting, and wanted to create an outdoors worshiping community. And about a few months in, I checked in with her, like, how's it going? How's your new worshiping community? And she said, something's happening that I did not plan for or expect. She said a lot of families are coming because she was having these gatherings like in parks, right, in the Adirondacks. And so lots of gorgeous, beautiful outdoor spaces. And she said, I have all these, not like throes of people, but she said she had a lot of people coming who had children who had different sort of developmental disabilities, again, things on the autism spectrum, things like this, because their kids could not be still in an indoor space. And it would, they would be getting that, as I said before, like that side eye, or people would be saying your kids are disruptive or control your kids better. But in an outdoor space, like, there was sort of an unlimited space, and you could also like keep an eye on them, but they could have like the roaming space that they needed,
Mhm.
and the worship could go on, and they could just function so much better in that outdoor space, and families felt a lot more welcome. And it was something she didn't plan for and didn't expect, but it happened naturally and then became a part of her ministry. And I thought about that during the pandemic. Like, we went outside, and there was conversations around accessibility with being outside. I heard pastors saying it's hard on some of my older people. The chairs don't feel as comfortable for them, or they're having trouble walking, or the ground feels uneven. And those are all serious concerns for sure. Um, but there was also this other thing that got opened up. And, there's certainly pluses and minuses to being inside too, right? I mean, if you're outside, you want to have canopy for, if it's, you got a lot of sun. For someone like me who, turns into a lobster in about 30 seconds, and sunburns like really, really fast. I have that super translucent Scottish skin, right? Um, I would like something over me just because I know I'm going to be sunburned pretty quickly. So, indoors is a plus for me in that way, but outdoors is a plus in other ways for me. So there's always that trade-off. And I think also talking about that in congregations, like, what are we giving up and what are we gaining, and how do we balance those pieces? So those are great, great ideas. Let's get into just some resources as we close up. We could be talking about this all day long. There's so much here. I thought there was a certain amount here, and there's like so much here. So we'll definitely do like a part two at some point, for sure, because this is really energizing. Ben and Katie, I'm excited about this conversation. But can you say a little bit about your organization, Ben, Respectability, that you work for, and also just maybe a run through a few resources that you think are really helpful? And then Katie, I want to close up by talking about this work you did during Lent, because I think it's really an interesting model. So, so Ben, tell us a little bit about your organization and their specific work.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. Absolutely. Um, yeah, and respectability, we will go through a name change in the next year, so um just be aware that that'll happen if you're like, wait, this changed all of a sudden. But it's an incredible organization, disability-led nonprofit, as I mentioned. We actually we've been around for 10 years. Started out in Washington, D.C., and when the pandemic began, went fully remote. So all of us are truly across the country, and participate remotely. We also do a lot of in-person work as well, doing convenings of different communities. Our organization has a four pillared approach. One of our most um, well-known parts of that is the entertainment news media side. We have really big emphasis on ensuring that disability is represented in media accurately and authentically. And we work with partners like Amazon and Disney and Netflix to do consulting and create a disabled-led entertainment community, which has been extraordinarily successful and is often what RespectAbility is known for, because of how much coverage in the media it receives. We also have a national workforce development group that tries to create new disabled professionals in the field. And we have uh, uh, with 6-month-long fellowships. We have these fellowship cohorts for disabled folks who are early in their career who want to get started, and those are fully remote. So if anybody listening wants to apply to a faith inclusion fellowship, the applications are open now, April 2024. And they cycle through every 6 months, and we get some incredible young professionals in that space. Um, and we also have our policy department that works both federally and statewide for advocating for federal policy benefiting disabled folks. And I have a little bit of crossover with that for my Interfaith Disability Advocacy Coalition work. But a faith inclusion department, which was kind of it began, its roots were in Jewish disability inclusion. And then the board of as of like 2022 really tried to kind of intentionally expand that work to a multi-faith community. So we work with faith communities across traditions. So, we're in synagogues talking about accessibility, talking about ramps to the bima, or we're in masjids talking about like, how do you have accessible, wudu, and like make sure that your ablutions, the places where you can wash are accessible for disabled folks. Or have accessible pilgrimage activities. So we work obviously in Christian communities as well. And I was brought on for that work. RespectAbility's Faith Inclusion Department does a lot. We have some incredible webinars and resources on our website that you can check out, that we talk extensively about different topics for the Christian community specifically. And we have full-on inclusive congregation guides that can give just kind of basic checklists for how your congregation can specifically implement accessibility in a logistic way, and also in a little bit of theological perspectives too, because there's some things that cut across tradition. And yeah, and we also do consulting. So if any congregation wants to reach out, we're happy to meet with you and have those conversations and give a more in-depth perspective from our subject matter knowledge. My supervisor has been working in the Jewish disability inclusion field for the past 25 years, has written a book from Longing to Belonging, How to Make an Accessible Faith Community. And you've heard a lot about me, so I'm happy to come and have those conversations. So
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you. These are fabulous resources, and we'll definitely include those. This is incredibly helpful stuff. As we get ready to wrap up, Katie, I would love it if you would talk about what you did during Lent this year, which we're just a few weeks into the Easter season at this point. You taught a Lenten class, and curious if you can just share a little bit with us about that, and how a study in a congregation might work, and how that intentional space of learning uh, could be an important piece of this work as well. So share with us about the Lent work you were doing, Katie. I was really interested in it as you were doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got involved in a congregation in New Hampshire, Kearsarge Community Presbyterian Church, KCPC, because of my work at Camp Wilmot, which is up in New Hampshire. And in talking with the pastor there and thinking about what that community needed, and thinking about accessibility options that have opened up since the pandemic began. Many more people are more comfortable on Zoom, and thinking about what accommodations work for people who have disabilities or have different access needs for various reasons. There was the sort of main study that happened at KCPC was during the day on Thursdays, which is great if you're retired. And, you know, it's harder to make a Bible study at 10 a.m. if you're working. And so in thinking about that community and their needs and what was coming up in the life of that church, I decided to offer a Lenten evening devotional community group on Zoom, which allowed people to come after work, to come from that community. I could lead it in Connecticut, but we had people come from across the country, people in Michigan, people in Minnesota, who were able to access this group. Folks who couldn't drive after dark were able to come. So it really opened up a space of welcome for a lot of people. And I also know that online spaces don't work for everybody. I think we've talked a few points on this call, like outdoor worship is great for some people and not as much for others. So it can be challenging when thinking about conflicting access needs, but sometimes having a variety of options can be helpful to allow people with different needs to access a variety of spaces. So the Disabling Lent Zoom discussion was based off of a resource from Justice Unbound, which does a lot of different social justice related programs and devotionals. So yeah, we used that curriculum and every week came together for an hour to pray and read the scripture verses together, which followed the lectionary season for year B in Lent, which we're in right now. And these reflections were written 3 years ago. The lectionary cycles through every 3 years. But so much of the wisdom from those devotionals were, you know, they're timeless. And so we would read the scripture passage, read the reflection, which were written by disability theologians and scholars and ministers and allies, and then take some time to reflect in community about our own experiences, our thoughts on the texts, what was coming up to us as we read these scriptures that you know were being preached on Sunday, and how to think about those texts and scriptures through a disability lens, with access, inclusion, and somatic empathy. And we just had really, really wonderful conversations in that group. It was a really sacred space.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And Justice Unbound is this fabulous resource that comes out of the Presbyterian Peacemaking Program. So a plug in there for the work that we do in peacemaking, and that this at the core of it is justice work and peacemaking work. And so making peace with others, making peace with ourselves, making peace with God, peace with our communities, peace is well-being. So I'm really excited about all that we've gotten to hear about and learn about on this podcast. I hope this has been, you know, really helpful for those who are listening in your congregations and your ministries, and a spot where you want to get more curious, learn more, and maybe do more. So thank you both so much for everything you've been able to share with us today. We'll definitely need to do a part 2, because we did a lot of big picture stuff, but maybe we could narrow in on some other pieces, and even some specific theological or liturgical pieces. This definitely needs a part 2. So we'll figure out a way to record that as we go through this this season of podcasts this spring and early summer. So thank you, Katie. Thank you, Ben, so much, so much for being on this podcast. What an amazing conversation. I'm so grateful for both of you, for your ministry, for who you are in this world, and for all that you help all of us do and be in ministry, and for the places God has called both of you to be. So, so grateful for both of you. So thank you for being on Connecting Our Conversations.
Thank you, Shannon.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.